let us first start with the master gland, that is our pituitary gland. Now, as with any new scientific inquiry or invention or discovery, usually we'll be progressing with the three-tier system. That is a 3R system. That is, first, there is a report, that is the R report of certain manifestations which are there. After which, some people will try to find out some reasoning, the R for reasoning of those particular reports. And following which, somebody or the other will come out with recommendations. That is the report, reasoning, and recommendation module of any scientific inquiry. So coming to the pituitary phenotype of COVID-19, now this includes three different varied manifestations. The first one of them is pituitary apoplexy. Now this manifests as severe intractable headache, as well as cranial nerve deficits, followed by endocrine insufficiencies. Now, this particular table has been taken from a journal which was almost 6 months back. And at that point of time, there were around about 6 cases of pituitary apoplexy, which were clinically correlated to a COVID-19 infection. However, since that time, when I went through the literature, there has always almost been like 16 to 20 more case reports of pituitary apoplexy, which are causally related to the COVID-19 infection, in fact, to severe COVID-19 infection. The second manifestation is hypophysitis. That is an inflammation of the pituitary stalk, which usually usually it presents as intractable hypotension, that is as adrenal insufficiency. The third manifestation is hyponatremia. Now, this is, I don't know if most people know this, but this is one of the most common electrolyte abnormalities which is seen in admitted patients in COVID-19. And in different series has been shown to be to the tune of almost 9%, varying to almost 52%. Imagine that, that's a huge proportion. People have been brave enough to actually go poking around the hypothalami and pituitary glands of post-mortem patients with COVID-19. And they have demonstrated that the SARS-CoV-2 genome is actually found there. Now, when these reports started coming in, people started reasoning as to what would be the cause of the varied manifestations. So coming first to the pituitary apoplexy. Now, this is mostly conjectural because it's a very difficult job to go searching around a pituitary gland which has undergone hemorrhage and necrosis all at the same time. So you won't find much information there. But what is proposed is that pituitary apoplexy is actually a form of cerebrovascular endothelial damage. Now we know that COVID-19 does have one of the complications as thrombosis, as CV stroke, and when you do have a pituitary stroke, it is followed by the apoplexy that we see here. Also, one of the most common manifestations of COVID-19 infection is anosmia or hyposmia, which has now been shown to be due to direct viral infection of the olfactory pathways rather than an immune-mediated manifestations. So it has been proposed or postulated that it is through the olfactory pathways that the virus actually enters into the brain and migrates to the hypothalamus as well as to the pituitary gland and leads to a pituitary apoplexy through a direct cytotoxic effect. The hypophysitis is, more or less widely regarded as a part of collateral damage, which is immune mediated due to the cytokine storm, which we now know is a very common manifestation of severe COVID-19. This SARS-CoV-2, that is a novel coronavirus, is actually a very smart virus. It keeps churning out versions of itself like alpha, beta, delta, now delta plus, as if they were versions of some software. And what it does is actually it mimics the pituitary stalk in some of its genome sequences. Now, this has also been shown from studies outside, I think outside India, from China, as well as from Italy. So there are certain sequences in the virus genome which mimic those of the pituitary stalk. Therefore, the antibodies which are directed against the SARS-CoV-2 virus can inadvertently affect the pituitary stalk, leading to hypophysitis. The hyponatremia is usually due to an excess of a molecule, which is the interleukin-6, which we treat by tocilizumab and whatnot. But IL-6 is a very well-known mediator of secretion of excess vasopressin from the posterior pituitary, which leads to excess water accumulation in the body, and ultimately which leads to a phenomenon which is known as SIADH, that is the syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion, ultimately leading to hyponatremia. There are other causes of hyponatremia, which include use or rather misuse of antibiotics, excessive glucocorticoids, positive pressure ventilation, all in COVID-19 severe cases. Along with that, we'll be seeing later that adrenal and thyroid dysfunction also contribute to euvolemic hyponatremia in the cases of pituitary. Now, both of these are manifested as hypothyroidism and functional adrenal insufficiency, but we'll be coming to them a little later on. So the recommendations from various pituitary societies at this point of time are that in the critical phase of COVID-19 therapy, one should always watch out for the following manifestations, that is intractable headache and cranial nerve deficits, which would be suggestive of apoplexy, severe hypotension, which is not responding to vasopressors, which would be suggestive of adrenal insufficiency, which would be one of the earliest manifestations of hypophysitis. The other manifestations usually come later, and of course, hyponatremia, which is very commonly seen in COVID-19. However, all of these manifestations are actually now rendered moot because of excess use of glucocorticoids during the COVID-19 therapy. And that is why these manifestations are usually masked. And when they are unmasked is when the glucocorticoids are withdrawn. So you should watch out for the symptoms more so in the post-recovery phase. That is almost maybe 15 days or 1 month later, because the apoplexy or hypophysitis is not going to recover within a month or so. Coming to the second gland, which is the adrenal gland. Now, this particular gland is fortunate enough to be more or less preserved, more or less, it's rather less affected by the COVID virus. However, in the initial stages of the pandemic, there were numerous reports of functional adrenal insufficiency, particularly from series which were coming out of Wuhan and series coming out from Italy and Spain, where we saw all those initial mass graves and all. Nowadays, there are very scanty reports of adrenal hemorrhage and necrosis. So people have been, going around exploring the adrenal glands of COVID-19 patients whenever they have the time, from resolving the pulmonary and other manifestations. The reasoning which is given is that ACE2 receptors are very highly expressed on the adrenal cortex. So it is likely to be a very direct cytotoxic, cytopathic effect of the virus, the hemorrhage as well as the necrosis. And like I said, this is a very smart virus. It mimics even the ACTH. There are a couple of amino acid sequences inside the viral genome which mimic certain sequences in the ACTH molecule. So what happens is that antibodies which are directed against the SARS-CoV-2 virus actually inadvertently affect the ACTH molecule also. And ultimately, the ACTH is not available, which leads to adrenal insufficiency and which manifests as severe hypotension, severe sepsis, inability to respond to technical medications and all. So just imagine, this is a virus which knows what molecules are going to be used against it and has already devised mechanisms to fight against it. The recommendations initially in the pandemic course were that an adequate cortisol response was considered to be a good predictor of COVID-19 mortality. Now, usually studies outside of China and Italy, they took a ballpark figure of 27 mics per deciliter to be a good indicator of stress response. However, again, this has now become moot because of the excess use of glucocorticoids during COVID-19. But I would request all of you, whoever is treating COVID-19 patients, to please use exogenous steroids judiciously. I'm sure you all know what all havoc exogenous steroids can play with the human body, but more importantly, in this particular context, what happens is that when we withdraw these steroids abruptly or even on a delayed format, the fatigue which results from secondary adrenal insufficiency is very commonly confused with the long COVID syndrome, that is, fatigue which is occurring because of a post-COVID syndrome. Many of those would be because of secondary adrenal insufficiency, secondary to the excess amount of glucocorticoids which were given in the ICU. So anything which was more than the equivalent of 10 milligrams of prednisolone for a duration of 3 weeks. Now, remember, this is not much at all. Okay, 10 milligrams of prednisolone is nothing. We'll probably be giving it left and right. It needs to be tapered and cortisol tested, which means a synectin stimulation test should be done before stopping this so that you know that the patient will mount an adequate cortisol response post stoppage of the exogenous glucocorticoids. The third and one of the most favorite targets of our COVID-19 virus is the thyroid gland. Now, the thyroid phenotype of COVID-19 manifests itself again in myriad ways. The first one is a direct affection of the thyroid gland, which is viral or decurvans thyroiditis, which is very commonly known. Hashimoto's and Graves have become very common post-recovery from COVID-19, especially in males. We know that these two diseases are far more common in females as compared to males, to the tune of almost 10:1. But if we take COVID-19 recovered patients, it is the ratio would be skewed in favor of males. And of course, SICU thyroid syndrome, which is a part of any major illness. Now, again, people have been brave enough to go poking around in the thyroid glands, and SARS-CoV-2 genome has been repeatedly demonstrated in the thyroid gland postmortem. The reasoning behind all of these illnesses, the subacute thyroiditis, as with any other form of viral thyroiditis, is probably due to a direct viral invasion and a cytotoxic effect of the virus on the thyroid gland. However, the autoimmune thyroid diseases are probably, again, collateral damage from the immune dysregulation that occurs with the COVID-19 virus during the cytokine storm, ultimately leading to either Hashimoto's or Graves, and in some cases, a fluctuating disease between Hashimoto's and Graves as well. The SICU thyroid syndrome, it depends on the degree and duration of the sickness, as with any other major critical illness. For now, the recommendations are few and far in between, but one particular thing that almost all endocrine societies agree upon is that the SICU thyroid syndrome during the COVID-19 viral replication phase correlates with the mortality of the patient. Now, this also correlates with mortality in any other severe illness, but the problem is that if you treat the low T3 and the low TSH during this particular phase, you're not going to do any great shakes for the mortality at all. So if you're not going to treat, don't even investigate. So please don't investigate for thyroid illnesses during active COVID-19 illness, because all you'll be doing is landing up with wild goose chase reports. But like with the case of diabetes and sugars, always get a thyroid function test done at 1 month follow-up. More often than more often than not, you're going to land up with some or the other manifestation of a thyroid illness. However, the treatment does not vary from the non-COVID patient at this point in time. This is likely to change in the future. The COVID-19 virus does not spare the parathyroid gland and the bone either. There are two major manifestations in terms of bone metabolism. One of them is hypocalcemia, and the other is hypovitaminosis D. Now, I'm sure most of you might not be aware that hypocalcemia is one of the major biochemical features of COVID-19 infection. In the SARS epidemic a few years back, it was shown to be up to the tune of 60%. In the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, it was almost up to the tune of 50 to 55%. But lo and behold, imagine that SARS-CoV-2 at the point of presentation into the hospital leads to a hypocalcemia prevalence of almost 81%. And it has already been shown that the calcium levels directly correlate with the LDH as well as the CT value in the RT-PCR reports. I'll come to this later as to how this is reported. Also, the calcium levels are independently predictive of ICU admission and mortality. Now, we are all very much aware about vitamin D. We've heard about it in multiple conferences and multiple Zoom webinars and all. And so we already know that there is a direct correlation, and multiple authors and, in multiple reports have confirmed this, that there is a direct correlation between COVID-19 prevalence and severity with latitude and sunlight exposure, which means indirectly with vitamin D. It is also confirmed that there is an inverse correlation between food fortification with vitamin D and COVID-19 mortality. Now, this is most commonly seen in the Mediterranean countries, Mediterranean European countries like Italy and Spain versus the Scandinavian countries, that is Finland and Denmark and Norway and Sweden, the mortality rate in the Scandinavian countries is far less as compared to the Italian and Spanish populations. And one of the reasons which is being postulated for this is because food is being fortified with vitamin D in those Scandinavian countries. Now, just imagine that the Italian and Spanish populations live at a much lower latitude as compared to the Scandinavian countries, and yet they have a much higher mortality. This is what is very popularly known as the Scandinavian paradox, even in terms of other illnesses, but it also holds true for the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, levels of vitamin D at the point of admission into the hospital show an inverse correlation with mortality. The reasoning, hypocalcemia. Now, this calcium molecule, actually the divalent calcium ion, is actually a necessary cofactor for the entry of viruses into the cells through the ACE2 or the TRMP-SS2 molecule. And it is also necessary for the transcription of the viral genome in situ. Now, what that basically means is if there is a higher viral load, you're going to deplete the amount of calcium that is there inside the blood, okay, leading to hypocalcemia. So much of that calcium is being utilized by the virus in its own processes of entering into the cell and replicating itself. And that is why it ultimately leads to hypocalcemia. And that is why there is a direct correlation between the RT-PCR values as well as the calcium levels. We are all well aware about the immune modulatory effects of vitamin D, so I'm not going to be going into the details of that. But apart from affecting the immunity directly, it also affects the calcium levels. We well know that. So vitamin D insufficiency definitely is one of the factors which leads to hypocalcemia very commonly. So recommendations at this point of time from the Endocrine Society and the AACE are that you should actively search for hypocalcemia and hypovitaminaceous D at the time of infection and treat them aggressively. I'm sure most of you are giving vitamin D to patients of COVID-19, but calcium needs to be supplemented as well, of course, after investigating. Now, this might be debatable, but I do believe that there is some, merit to mentioning vitamin D as a form of preventive epidemiology quotient. And it has been seen in certain reports, epidemiological reports across the world, that vitamin D sufficient populations have had lesser problems with COVID-19 severity and mortality. The testes and the ovary are not spared either. Now, there are some very interesting observations about the gonads. Now, the first one is that the susceptibility to infection with COVID-19 is equivalent in men and women. However, the susceptibility to severe illness and mortality far exceeds in men as compared to women. Now, funny observation, I don't know who has found this out, but bald men and women with androgenic alopecia are far more prone to COVID-19 infection and mortality. It has also been seen from reports outside of Japan and Korea that hypogonad males and patients of prostate cancer on androgen deprivation therapy are less susceptible to COVID-19 infection. And an interesting thing is that post-COVID recovery, secondary male factor infertility has been demonstrated to increase by a factor of almost 4 times. Now, just imagine at the start of the pandemic, it was the gynecologists who were believing that 9 months into the lockdown, you're going to have a baby boom because people would have nothing better to do at home, during the lockdown phase. But unfortunately, or fortunately for the infertility specialists, it is the male infertility which is taking over right now. The reasoning behind this is that we already know that androgens influence the susceptibility to infection and mortality in COVID-19. The reason behind this is still in flux. There are various postulates. One fact which is very well known is that the ACE2 gene, the receptor gene for the entry of the SARS-CoV-2 into the human cells, is present on the X chromosome. That means that some form of parental imprinting can lead or can influence the degree of COVID mortality and morbidity. Also, androgens influence the transcription of both of the receptor molecules required for the entry of SARS-CoV-2 into the human cells, that is ACE2 and TRMP-SS2. We already know that androgens negatively influence the immune environment. This is very well demonstrated by the fact that autoimmune illnesses are far more common in females as compared to males, which can be taken as a surrogate marker of a hyperactive or an overactive immune system in females. And then there are, of course, the social and environmental factors. Males are far more prone to smoking. They have far more incidence and prevalence of comorbid illnesses such as diabetes and thyroid and cardiovascular disease and, not thyroid, hypertension. And of course, males are far less likely to follow COVID-19 norms, and I would agree to that. The secondary infertility can be explained by multiple factors. It would be surprising for most of you that the receptor concentration of ACE2 on the gonads is highest in the body. It is higher than even the pulmonary epithelial, the pulmonary endothelial cells, the pulmonary alveolar epithelial cells. It is higher than that. Now, as was seen in the SARS epidemic a few years back, that orchitis was one of the major manifestations of the SARS epidemic. So direct invasion of the Sertoli cells by the novel coronavirus has also been demonstrated. So what this has resulted in is that we have found that there is a higher degree of decreased sperm counts and decreased sperm quality, as well as decreased sperm motility post-COVID-19 infection. But it is not just the Sertoli cells which are affected, even the Leydig cells are affected, and this leads to lower testosterone and higher LH levels, ultimately leading to lower intratesticular testosterone levels, again, ultimately manifesting as oligozoospermia, asthenospermia, and whatnot. For now, there really are no recommendations other than if you're a male patient, and on top of that, if you're a bald patient in the ICU, please watch out. And there are no guidelines for the management of secondary infertility post-COVID recovery. I'm sure it is a work in progress. There is a lot of work to be done in this regards as of yet. Now, coming to the mother of all endocrine and metabolic diseases, that is diabetes and obesity. Now, much has been said about diabetes and obesity being a major risk factor, being a major comorbidity in terms of increasing the mortality of ICU patients in COVID-19. So we'll not be going into too much detail, but this particular cartoon explains itself. Diabetes as well as obesity as well as hypertension increase mortality in COVID-19 patients to a great deal of degree. The numbers may vary from study to study. This particular number of 28% of COVID-19 being non-survivors was taken from a population, that is the Japanese population, which had a baseline obesity prevalence of only about 9 to 10%. So 3 times the degree of mortality risk. Now, one more thing which we have found out is that there is definitely a worsening of pre-existing diabetes and new onset diabetes post-COVID-19 infection. This is not uncommon. We have tons and tons of patients who are presenting like this, even in the absence of diabetogenic drugs like steroids and corticosteroids, which are being given during the COVID-19 infection. But on top of that, a funny thing is that we have also noticed that there is a worsening of pre-existing obesity and new onset obesity post-COVID-19, not infection, but post-COVID-19 lockdown. And I'm sure all of us are suffering from, some or the other degree of this particular syndrome, especially kids who have been restricted to their homes, who are doing online classes, and, they have nothing better to do. They are not allowed to go outside and play. The reasoning that is being given for diabetes being one of the major effectors of mortality in COVID-19, I will not go into the details of how diabetes affects the immune system. Of course, we are all well aware of that. But certain specific pathways which are important in diabetes affecting the COVID-19 mortality would be like this. That is the hyperinsulinemia, which actually deregulates the regulatory T cells into cytokine T cells, ultimately leading to increased TNF alpha, IL-6, IL-1 beta, ultimately manifesting as the cytokine storm. There is something interesting to be said about the DPP-4 molecule. I'll come to this a little later. Most of the diabetic patients who are also hypertensive are going to be on some or the other ACE2 inhibitor or ARBs, and that they lead to an upregulation of this. I'll also come to this a little bit later. And this is what is known as the local renin-angiotensin system, which is also upregulated in cases of COVID-19 infection. All of these are factors which actually increase the amount of uptake of virus into the cells, as well as later on increase the inflammation and fibrosis resulting into lung injury. Now, the new onset COVID-19 post-diabetes, this has been proven without doubt in this paper, which was published in Nature Metabolism a couple of months back from a Chinese group. What they have shown is that they've tried to stain the beta cells with antibodies against C-peptide. This is stain for the glucagon. This is a stain for the somatostatin. And these are stains for the ACE2 receptor. Now, if you overlap these two, you get all these yellow, which means there are common sites of ACE2 receptors and C-peptide stimulation, which means that ACE2 receptors are present in very high quantities on the beta cells. This is not the case with glucagon, neither is this the case with somatostatin. This indirectly, or I could say even directly, gives an evidence of a direct cytotoxic effect that the SARS-CoV-2 virus has on pancreatic beta cells, leading to new onset diabetes or worsening of pre-existing diabetes by causing insulin insufficiency. The same thing has also been shown with C-peptide, glucagon, and somatostatin, as well as the TRMP-SS2. Now, this is an overlap between the TMPR-SS2 and the C-peptide molecule antibodies, whereas they do not overlap in case of the glucagon as well as the somatostatin. So even this particular cofactor of the receptor, that is TMPR-SS2, is highly common in expression in terms of the surface of the beta cells, along with the C-peptide molecule. The obesity reasoning. Now, there are multiple reasons why obesity can lead to an increase in the mortality of patients with COVID-19. They deal with a decreased respiratory reserve, which means that there is a decreased expiratory volume, decreased gas exchange. Most obese patients suffer from obstructive sleep apnea. Obese patients are highly likely to have comorbidities such as hypertension, diabetes, and they have an increased thrombogenic potential. Now, this is also very interesting because ACE2 receptors are very highly found on adipose tissue cells, which means that you could have an adipose reservoir of SARS-CoV-2 virus, which ultimately leads to increased viral shedding and load, and later on predisposing a patient to COVID-19 cytokine storm. We already know that obesity is a chronic inflammatory condition rather than a mechanical condition, ultimately favoring a lesser regulatory T cell phenotype. All of these predispose to a leading of a cytokine storm in an obese patient. The diabetes recommendations at this point of time, definitely good control of DM before, during, and after COVID-19 infection is a must, whatever it takes. This is again controversial. Metformin has in some studies been shown to be protective against COVID-19 infection, but definitely in serious COVID-19 infection, I would suggest that you omit it or at least avoid it due to the risk of acidosis, that is lactic acidosis. Definitely avoid SGLT2 inhibitors during COVID-19 infection. No dapagliflozin, no empagliflozin, because you will land up with another complication, which is known as euglycemic diabetic ketoacidosis. All other hypoglycemia agents can be continued provided adequate glycemic control is maintained, but the fact remains that the earliest, the quickest, and the best glycemic control can be obtained with the help of insulin. So do not be hesitant to start off with insulin therapy right at the point of admission of the patient. The important thing is new onset diabetes post-COVID needs to be searched for at least within the month post-COVID and needs to be managed aggressively in the initial stages itself, because this is due to insulin insufficiency rather than an increase in the insulin resistance. Also, before I forget, I haven't mentioned it over here, but there are numerous case reports. Even personally, I have seen at least 4 or 5 new onset type 1 diabetic patients who have developed type 1 diabetes within the month post-COVID recovery. Now, I know that this cannot be causally related, but then I'm sure that the COVID-19 storm and collateral damage from that dysregulation has something to play with it. Also, because the COVID-19 virus actually infects the beta cells in a direct cytotoxic way, I'm sure it reduces the insulin secretion very quickly. There's another interesting thing is that the type 1 diabetic patients, well, this is a personal experience. This might be a personal bias. I'm not sure it has been corroborated by other authors or not, but usually type 1 diabetic patients do have a honeymoon phase post, some degree of glycemic control initially. However, the patients who have developed type 1 diabetes post COVID-19, they tend not to have honeymoon phase, at least till now, what I have noticed. Four out of the five patients that I have had, they really haven't entered into a honeymoon phase, even during 4 to 6 months post starting insulin therapy. Obesity recommendations, well, I really don't have anything for you. If you do have something, please tell them to me. How do I tell patients who are obese to get off their butts and start exercising when everybody starts believing that COVID-19 is an airborne virus, and the moment they step outside their home, they're going to get infected with the COVID-19 virus? Also, kids need to be encouraged to, get off their seats and stop just the online classes, maybe go outside, maybe play, but then really, I've been struggling with this for the past 1.5 years. I hope somebody can give me a recommendation for the same. So to summarize, COVID-19 has affected almost all endocrine glands in myriad ways. We've discussed about the pituitary, the gonads, the bones, pancreas, obesity, adrenals, thyroid. And there is also a bidirectional relationship that exists between many of the endocrine glands and COVID-19. COVID-19 can cause some degree of endocrine dysfunction, and endocrine dysfunction can worsen the COVID-19 infection. Now, one of the funny things that I have noticed about this COVID-19 pandemic is that we have thrown everything at the virus. Okay, we have used all sorts of pharmacological therapies, be it antithrombotics, be it immunosuppressives, be it immunomodulators, be it nutraceuticals, be it antivirals, antibacterials, antibiotics, antifungals, antiparasitic agents, for Christ's sake. But we have really not succeeded. So, well, we endocrinologists thought, why should we be left behind? So there are certain endocrine and metabolic targets which are being proposed, which are being studied for COVID-19 therapy. One of them is melatonin. Melatonin is well known for its anti-inflammatory, its immunosuppressive effects, as well as sedative effects. And it also, to some degree, reduces pulmonary fibrosis. And there are now multiple cases, there are multiple studies being conducted around the world to see whether melatonin actually helps in severe COVID-19 infection. Oxytocin, again, is an anti-inflammatory molecule. And also, there is one particular benefit of using oxytocin is that it increases the amount of nitric oxide in the pulmonary vasculature, leading to more dilatation of the pulmonary vasculature, leading to a probably increased ventilation perfusion ratio. This is also being tried out in certain studies. Now, the interesting thing about DPP-4, DPP-4 is now well established as a cofactor of viral entry into the human cells, in addition to ACE2 as well as TMPRSS2, which means that if a diabetic patient was already on DPP-4 inhibitors, such as sitagliptin or linagliptin or teneligliptin or what have you, it is possible that they might not have severe COVID-19 infection because the DPP-4 molecule has already been inhibited. However, this still needs corroboration and further studies. And the major confounding factor here would be that the site at which the DPP-4 inhibitors bind to the DPP-4 molecule is quite different from the site at which the coronavirus actually binds to the DPP-4 molecule. In the initial stages of the pandemic, ACE2 was considered to be a big villain because people who were on ACE inhibitors, they were postulated to be having higher amount of ACE2 receptors on their body, which would facilitate the entry of virus into the human cells. However, this has now been refuted by multiple cardiovascular guidelines. But what is shown is that ACE2 inhibitors being used later on in the infection course, that is later on in the post the viral replication phase, in the immune phase, actually leads to some degree of benefit. Again, it's all up in the air as of right now. Estrogens, well, estrogens we know have an antithrombotic effect. Women prior to their menopause have far less incidences of myocardial infarction and other thrombotic episodes. So they have been tried out in this as well, COVID-19 as well, but of course not to a great deal of success till now. Statins, of course, everybody recommends now that you should continue statins. Sometimes some guidelines even recommend that you should add statins or even fibrates during COVID-19 infection in order to take advantage of their vascular stabilizing effect. Now with this, I would like to end the talk. And well, any comments or questions or bouquets or brickbats are all welcome.
You can stop sharing the screen, Samir. So it was wonderful, Dr. Samir. No brickbats, of course, a lot of bouquets for you, because your talk was very enlightening in terms of new knowledge. Probably we have been listening to all the talks on COVID, but we have not heard much about this. All endocrine glands being affected, especially your mention about hypocalcemia, adrenal insufficiency causing the probably long COVID can be explained with that. So many new things we have come to know. Let me see if there is any question on the chat box. Dr. Hemant Sant has asked a question. What is the endocrine basis of increased microendothelial cell lining damage, thrombogenicity in COVID, which seems irreversible killer mechanism, ventilation perfusion by clotting lung blood vessels?
I'll just have to check this one out. Increased microendothelial cell lining damage, thrombogenicity in COVID-19, which seems irreversible killer mechanism, perfusion by clotting lung blood vessels. Yeah, so this is what I was talking about. See, most of us actually know about the renin-angiotensin system, which is in a systemic renin-angiotensin system. But what people most often than not do not know about that there is a local renin-angiotensin system in most of the systems inside the body. So when the coronavirus actually affects a particular cell on the ACE2 receptors, there is a downregulation of the ACE2 receptors. This leads to an increase in the local angiotensin and a local aldosterone concentration, which ultimately leads to increased thrombogenicity, which ultimately leads to increased vasoconstriction, which predisposes the patient to clots. And this is one of the common mechanisms which has now been proposed. It is, of course, a postulate because most of the things in COVID-19 right now are postulates. But this is what I came across in my, in my research into this endocrine basis of this particular mechanism. And new onset diabetes in pediatric or adolescent population versus adults. Comments. Okay. Well, I wouldn't say that I have gone through the world literature on this, but what I'll say is my own personal experience. The adolescent population, I have seen at least 3 or 4 type 2 diabetics. Type 2 diabetics in the adolescent population post COVID-19, at least 4 or 5 type 1 diabetics in the adolescent population post COVID-19. Now, of course, you can't attribute it to that. But just imagine that these are developing in the first month post COVID-19, and that is why you can have a direct, some sort of correlation between the two.
What was the age group like type 1 in?
The age group was around 12 to 18, most of them.
Most of them, okay. And what was their presentation like?
Oh, presentation, classical type 1 diabetes. So one more thing, that classical type 1 diabetes, they did not have very high HbA1c values, which means that it was whatever had happened, it was a permanent diabetes which happened in the last 1 month itself. So the HbA1c values were something like 8 or 9 compared to what we usually expect in type 1 diabetic patients, something like 12 or 13. But they were fulminant presentations which happened within the 1 month post-COVID itself. That is why I also believe that COVID-19 was responsible in bringing them about.
Right. And Dr. Sital Desai from Bangalore, she's a pediatrician. She has commented that we have been seeing more, is a surge in decay and outcome of MISC in kids. So she wants some explanation.
Yeah, so well, we were already discussing about this. So this surge in decay, no doubt. We have also been seeing, apart from the fact that post-COVID-19 diabetes is affecting, but this decay is in most of my patients has been because of poor availability of insulin in the peripheral areas. Because of the lockdown and all, many of my type 1 diabetic patients have not been able to have access to insulin in the proper quantities, and that is why I think they're landing up with decay more often than not. Of course, the other reason is that early worsening, they have lost their follow-ups basically. So early worsening of the glycemic status has not been taken care of pretty early to prevent the diabetic ketoacidosis.
Right. Dr. Samir Contractor has put a comment that what about rumors of vaccine leading to diabetes in future.
Yeah, well, only time will tell whether this is a rumor or whether it is not, because we don't have enough information about it. As of right now, I don't think I have seen anybody who has developed diabetes post-vaccination, at least.
Right. Unfortunately, somebody has started sharing this. Vinod bhai, please stop sharing the screen. It is disturbing our screen. So, Vinod bhai, you have,
Sure.
please stop sharing. I think Dr. Sulin Trivedi wants to ask, whatever is studied and shown here, is this true for pediatric population? I don't know. It's a general
Or
question.
any similar observations in pediatric group of patients? Well, the endocrine manifestations, I don't think I have seen very commonly in pediatric populations. Most of them have been the adult populations, I'll agree. But the diabetes, yes, certainly is there in the pediatric population.
Mhm. And Dr. Pradeep Seth has asked, have you seen cases of prolonged headache more than 10 days following vaccination?
Or many of them. In fact, many of them ultimately turned out to be COVID. Post the first dose of vaccine, many of them actually turned out to be COVID positive cases, because no, I don't think there's any endocrine cause for that. I think it is, either a vaccine reaction or it is to do with the fact that they develop COVID immediately following the vaccination.
No, mostly what people say is that when they go for vaccination, there is a lot of crowding and probably they get the infection from the site of vaccination.
It's quite possible because
5 days incubation period, they get the disease after 5 days. So
yeah, so most of these patients, they've been presenting like a fever chalu hua COVID vaccination ke baad aur khatam hi nahi hua. And then they got a COVID-19 test and they found that it was the RT-PCR was positive.
Right. So I think the chat box questions are all over. Is there any comment from anybody? I have a few questions, Dr. Samir, regarding this hypocalcemia and hypovitaminosis. A lot of vitamin D is being used. Have you come across hypervitaminosis D in such patients? I mean, a lot of vitamin D is being used.
Yeah. More often than not, I have not. I'll just point out certain things. Prior to this pandemic, I had never seen hypovitaminaceous D in a kid presenting with hypocalcemia. Means the degree of severity of hypovitaminosis D causing severe hypocalcemia, causing seizures. I have seen at least 4 to 5 post this COVID-19 pandemic. But hypercalcemia, that is the only sole toxicity of hypervitaminosis D, I don't think I have come across. In fact, apart from the pediatric population, what I'll say is, right now we do not even know what the upper value of normal of vitamin D is, because what we only have is the lower value of normal, that is 30. That is the point at which PTH in the body starts to rise. But there is a lot of literature which now supports that higher levels of vitamin D actually have some neurological benefits, actually have immunological benefits, apart from the bone, of course. So we really do not know what is the upper level of normal. And this is very well accepted in endocrine society guidelines and all, who say that, okay, we still need further research. And I think vitamin D is a very active area of research. But yes, there were, if I just correlate it with my adult population, very rarely you can have hypervitaminosis D with hypercalcemia. But the only situation where I have seen it is post injectables. It has never happened post oral therapy. It is only that 3 lakh, 6 lakh injections, Arachidol, vagera. So it only happens post that. I have never seen it happening post oral therapy at all.
Anosmia carries a better prognosis. I mean, it is generally believed that anosmia carries a better. So, is there any endocrine basis for that?
I don't think it is an endocrine basis. I think the only postulate that is given for that is that most of the virus is concentrated inside the nasal passages and it has not gone down. But really, nobody knows the answer to that. But yes, it does correlate with a better prognosis.
So, Pradeep, are you still into some comments because your hand is raised? Pradeep bhai. Okay. It seems there are no more comments or questions. So, thank you, Dr. Samir, once again for being with us and writing on so many things that we didn't know actually. Yes, Dr. Sulin, last comment.
Good morning, sir. very good session so far. There is one interesting point I have heard at present, that gonads have more receptors than even lung, right?
Yeah.
So has there been any study in 1.5 years of time now that the
Hmm.
gonads are being damaged, and that should be monitored, their function should be monitored now biochemically by lab parameters? Do you
Yeah.
recommend it to get monitored in at least in 20 to 50 years of aged patients?
Actually, it's a very good question because I asked myself the same question. Because if I say that there is hypogonadism post COVID-19, at the same point, I say that hypogonadism is protective against severe COVID-19, both of those facts are contradictory. I already showed that androgens, when you give androgen therapy to patients, they actually fare worse. But COVID-19 itself is causing some degree of hypogonadism. But people have been far more concerned with saving lives rather than saving the future generation in terms of protecting the reproductive outcome for now. I don't think there are too many reproductive studies that have come out which show whether we should be monitoring or we should not be. I'm sure with time these things are going to come out.
Oh, okay, okay. Thank you, thank you.
Hello, Dr.
Yes.
Saini.
Yes, sir.
I think there is one other aspect I found, whether there is increased failure of pregnancy or abortion rate, or you should coordinate with endocrine aspects with the obstetricians and gynecologists to give us the data what happened in last 1.5 years, whether there were lot of failures of pregnancy, because I have found 2 cases such who were COVID positive and they aborted.
Right. Okay. I'm
And
well.
another aspect is that whenever nature strikes, the body tries to defend it by making it less vulnerable. So the answer to your question about gonads is that COVID tries to make the person hypogonad. So at least the further effect of corona or COVID is protected. That is my theorem.
Yeah, but COVID also decreases the amount of cortisol being produced. So COVID is actually trying to protect itself again, from one of the therapies that is being used against it. So
Correct. But cortisol will prevent hyperglycemia. Correct. So it will prevent hyperglycemia. Means there is a fight between the pro factor and the against factor. So this you have to think it holistically. And only
yeah,
endocrinologists can think like that.
I'll
Thank
have
you
to
for
think
your
about it correctly.
very good. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
What is seen in pregnancy in second wave is that there is high mortality amongst pregnant women, and there is high incidence of prematurity also. So that is a known fact during the second wave. First wave, we didn't see so many mortality amongst pregnant women. That is what I know about pregnancy and COVID.
Yes, correct. Satish bhai, yesterday only the government of India okayed vaccination for pregnant women, and Foxy also did it last month. But
Right.
people educated pregnant are refusing to take vaccination.
So that the the onus is on us, the clinicians and practicing doctors, to encourage women for taking vaccine. So I do that in all my patients' mothers, that I encourage vaccination amongst breastfeeding women as well as now pregnant women also.
Correct.
So any other comments? I see Dr. Hemant has just arrived. Hemant, you are the next speaker. I am just taking a pleasure to announce that Dr. Hemant Antani is going to be our next speaker. And next Saturday, he'll be talking on very interesting topic, and that is titled as "Where is my stethoscope?" So that's about importance of loss. I mean, we are losing that art of clinical medicine, and he's going to remind us about using our stethoscope well. So welcome, Dr. Hemant. Any comments from you?
Thank you, Satish. I think it was a wonderful presentation by Samir. Beautifully done. One of the things which, I came across, and I'm sure he would know better than me, is the occurrence of diabetes is one of the reasons is the direct damage of the beta cells here. That's what is being now proposed, which could be responsible for we seeing more diabetic patients. Otherwise, that is one of the theory, but it's right that the data or literature is still yet to come, because to come to a concrete conclusion. But these are all real world evidences, as we have been seeing. Samir, wonderfully done, beautifully explained, and it was a marvelous presentation. It was a treat to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So thank you all. We end the session here. We meet again to next Saturday morning with Dr. Hemant Antani talking about where is my stethoscope. So thank you all. Thank you for joining.